That's it. Wow, what a great crowd. Thanks you all for coming to this, another event from the Salem Center for Policy here at the Macomb School of Business. If you don't know what the Salem Center for Policy is, we are a free market, liberty-oriented policy institute within the University of Texas. If you want a visual for what that means, we're a blueberry in a red state. This is a tiny, tiny red seed inside of the blueberry, okay? And not partisan, just reasonable. So a few years ago when I had the opportunity to start the Salem Center, I was thinking about I'm an economist and a statistician by training. So I was always a little bit concerned about the fact that facts and clear thinking about policy decisions was not something that we're teaching our students anymore. They were not presenting to them in a way that was objective. And the Salem Center rose from this idea that, well, let's just focus on that. Let's create something, a place and a platform that allows our students to see facts, to see ideas, evaluate for themselves, and then make decisions on their own, as opposed to being told what they should or should not do. From that, if you look at our tagline, no solutions, only trade-offs, little tongue-in-cheek, but Bjorn is someone that for years and years and years has been advocating for cost-effective solutions for the world's most pressing problems. I think that's I'm quoting from the Copenhagen Consensus, which is the think tank that he started and has been very successful over the years. So he was a big inspiration to my tagline, to what we try to do here as a group, and it's wonderful to have him here with us today. So just to give you a little bit of an introduction about Bjorn, again, I'm going to read from his biography. Bjorn researches the smartest ways to do good. In his think tank, the Copenhagen Consensus, he has worked with hundreds of economists to try to promote the most effective solutions to the world's greatest challenges, from disease to hunger to climate to education. It's about the trade-offs, it's about the cost-benefit analysis. Today, he's going to speak to us about climate. And I had my book with me here a second ago. We live, again, in an institution where if you think about climate change, you probably are thinking from a very one-sided perspective. And hopefully, Bjorn, through his work, through his book, through his talk today, can give us a different perspective, a perspective that is less alarmist, a perspective that's more solutions-oriented, and something that takes into account the trade-offs that we face in this problem. So without further, Bjorn, please. Oh, sorry. I forgot one thing. Very important. This would not be possible without, first of all, the help from Ted Williams. And I want to give him a hand here for Ted from Rockport Companies was instrumental in putting together a giant group of supporters here. You all can see they were in front from our energy industry, not only in Austin, but in the state of Texas. So let's thank them all again. And to make this possible. So Bjorn's going to speak for a while, and then we have mics here in the front. We're going to sit down after he's done, and I'll take questions from the audience. So please stand up, go to the front, and I'll call on you. And as we get going here. There we go. Bjorn, please join us.
Carlos, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Carlos promised me I would get a T-shirt afterwards with the no solutions, just trade-offs, and I love that. I was also told we discussed whether I should use my computer or the computer that's here, and they said, oh, we can just use this computer. And then only just before we went on, they said sometimes it switches off, but it'll come back pretty soon. So that's what you're going to see up here apparently. I would love to take you through how I think we need to think about climate change if we're going to make a difference. So look, a lot of people are incredibly worried about climate change. And if this is the end of the world, obviously we should come out and say that. But if we think it's the end of the world and it's not, it's likely that we're going to be making bad decisions on climate. So I'd like to take you through what I think is some of the important discussions here. I'm actually not going to spend all that much time on solutions because I think we're only going to be able to get to solutions once we've started getting people to cool off a little bit, not be like over worried, but start to think about how do we think about climate in the sort of correct space. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes. I think it's incredibly important that we have talk afterwards. So I'm I'll just simply cut off. And if we run a little bit out of time, I'll make sure I just do it shorter. So look, first of all, global warming, it's real, it's man-made. I don't think there's any point in having any other sort of input to this. Again, I'm not a climate scientist. I work with a lot of these climate scientists, and that's certainly the impression I get when you read the UN Climate Panel report and so on. I think this is not where the discussion should be. The discussion should be in that the climate change conversation is often vastly exaggerated, and that leads to bad decisions. So I'd like to first show you a little bit about how we're over-worried, and then talk about how we should think smartly about doing solutions, and then, of course, what are the solutions. I'd also like to just briefly mention some of the stuff I do, because this is not really my day job. My day job is actually talking about all the other things in the world, because if you think outside of a rich world context, most people on this planet worry about the fact that their kids might die from easily curable infectious diseases tonight, or that there's not enough food, or there's not good education, and all these other very, very basic issues that we are fortunate enough not to worry about. But of course, we should recognize that when we're saying we should do something about global warming to help the world, well, maybe they also want help with a lot of other things, and maybe they want more help with that first. So I'll get back to that, and at least also get to it in the question. But fundamentally, global warming is real, but it's often vastly exaggerated. One good example is Guterres, the UN Secretary General, but I mean, pretty much everyone makes this. This is one of his many quotes. The world faces a grave climate emergency every week, bring new climate-related devastation, floods, droughts, heat waves, wildfires, superstorms. It's not like we haven't heard this before. This is pretty much the standard kind of conversation. He also says we're in a battle for our lives, and climate change is the biggest threat to the global economy. This is a little bit true and a lot of false, and I'll try and show you why that is. So again, climate change is a real problem, but this exaggeration doesn't actually help, and it very likely makes us make bad decisions on where we should be focusing our resources. I just want to go through a few of the things. He talks about superstorms. We just had Hurricane Ian come through, and very clearly this is top of mind for a lot of people. So what do we actually think about hurricanes? I'm going to take my starting point with the UN Climate Panel, the IPCC, and they tell us in the past, identifying past trends in subtropical cyclones, that's what they call hurricanes, remains a challenge, and they have low confidence in any long-term trends. And in the future, they expect that we will probably see stronger hurricanes, and we will likely see fewer hurricanes. Now, fewer is less good than stronger is worse. That's why it's a problem. So we will get a problem. We'll have fewer but stronger storms, and that will be a problem. But again, we need to get a sense of proportion here. So what do we actually know up till now? Not that there's been an increase. Remember, a lot of people will show to you, so Financial Times last week showed you how there's more and more named storms. So we've seen a dramatic increase over the last 150 years. Why? Because we're not very good at identifying storms out in the middle of nowhere where there were no ships 150 years ago. Now, of course, we have satellites that pick up on every one of them. So named storms is a very bad way to see this. Actually, we're good at evidence to show that this is entirely driven by our technology, that we can identify them better. Also, if you just look at, as New York Times did last week, they just show you from 1980 until today. Yes, and there's been an increase. Why? Because 1980 was a very low year. Actually, the 70s and 80s had very little hurricanes, lots of hurricanes in the 50s, 60s. You're not well informed if you just take your starting point at the low end and then say, oh, see, an increase. So I want to show you the number of landfalling hurricanes in the US from 1900. This is when we believe that it's very unlikely that there would have been a landfalling hurricane that nobody observed. So this is a good way to make sure all of these have been observed since 1900. And what you see is, perhaps contrary to what most people would think, that we have seen a slightly declining number of landfalling hurricanes to the US. This is probably the best measure that we have in the world, and it does not show an increase, actually a slight decrease. It's insignificant, but again, the point here is to recognize it's not such that we're seeing more and more hurricanes. If anything, we're probably seeing slightly fewer. But aren't we seeing more strong hurricanes? That's again, sort of a comeback. And again, if you look at the numbers for strong hurricanes, so major hurricanes, category 3 and above, Again, no, that's not what we see. We actually see a slight decline. You can also see the very remarkable gap there was for 11 years after 2006. So what really is the case here is the data doesn't sort of support this catastrophic sense that we get from the media and many other places. My point is just simply, we need to have that data out and show when Guterres and many others are telling us, superstorms. Well, actually, the data tells us this. This does not mean that we are not likely to see in the future that there'll be fewer but stronger storms, and that is going to be a problem. So we can actually say two things at the same time. This is not the end of the world. This is not a total catastrophe, but yes, there is a problem and we recognize it. And that, of course, gets us to, then we need to start talking about how do we fix it. Likewise, when you talk about wildfire, everybody loves this. It's a great story, right? But we actually have good data for how much stuff burns in the world. We have reasonable data, partly because climate models need it, from 1900. So in 1900, about 4.2% of the world's surface burnt every year. And since then, over the last century, this has not gone up. This has gone down. Again, you hear constantly a world on fire because of global warming. Actually, that's not the case. What we've seen is a decline. We're now down to about 3.2 or thereabouts. Of course, this is a reconstruction. We don't have good data. We don't have perfect data back from 1900, but we do have satellites from the end of last century until today. And again, they also show a very clear drop in the amount of burning. So we're now down to about 2.5% this year in 2021, right? So very contrary to what you hear. Why? Because most people actually don't like fire. And so they make sure that fire is less likely to happen. We actually adapt to a lot of these things, right? It's not rocket science. Again, this does not mean that there's no problem, but we need to recognize we're not in a position where the world is on fire and everything is just burning up. Actually, if we look out into the future, so if we do nothing about climate, it is very likely that we will see an even a stronger decline in the amount of fire on the planet. But if we did strong climate policy, it'll be even less fire. And again, this tells us the very simple point that we can both say, this is not a catastrophe. You know, the world is not just all burning. Actually, it's declining. But if we do climate policy, it can decline even more. Or to put it differently, we could actually have a world where it will be even better with climate. So we can, with climate policy. So we can say two things at the same time. This is not the end of the world, but yeah, climate policy does make sense. We need to be able to have that conversation, and we don't today. It's almost entirely, it's the end of the world and we need to do everything in the kitchen sink. That's probably not the right way to think about this. Again, flooding, we're being told that there's more and more flooding. The UN climate panel actually tells us there's very low confidence in human influence and change in the high river flows on the global scale. But what do we again know? The best data we have is from the US. Cost of flooding in the US, most people probably think it's gone up. Actually, it's gone down dramatically. Remember, this has to be done, even the UN will tell you this has to be done percent of GDP, because obviously if you have twice as much stuff, the same kind of flood will cost twice as much damage. So you have to at least do it in proportion to how much stuff is there to see. I told you this was going to happen, but it'll come right back. So in early part of last century, it used to cost about 0.5% of US GDP. Now it's fallen down to about 1/10 of that. We used to have in 1913, the biggest flood catastrophe in modern history in the US was more than 2% of US GDP. Today, it's typically about 0.05. This is an amazing achievement. Again, why? Because people are smart, people adapt. This does not mean had there been no global warming, this might actually have been even lower. So it's not denying that there's not an issue of climate, but it's instead of saying climate means everything goes to hell, it simply means things get better, but possibly slightly less better, which is obviously not quite as dramatic, not quite as traumatic for most people, right? Global warming means things don't get better quite as fast. That's not quite the catchy phrase as global warming makes everything, burn up. But we need to be able to say this. And again, I think one of the reasons why we get it so wrong on global warming is that we miss adaptation. We miss the fact that we actually adapt to most of these things. I think one of the strongest sort of single graphs that you can make, and again, you have to excuse me, I'm just going to show you a barrage of data points because I'm a statistician. I think that's kind of sexy, right? Doesn't mean that everybody else does, but it's really good for us to be able to have a good conversation about these things. So I think this is probably the best single graph to show to people. So we have good data on how many people die from all kinds of climate-related disasters, so floods, drought, storms, wildfire, and extreme temperatures. This comes from the International Disaster Database. If anything, it's probably underrepresented in the past, but again, big catastrophes we picked up on even 100 years ago. So how many people died from climate-related disasters 100 years ago? People would probably think it was very few, and then it just gets worse and worse. It's exactly the opposite. In the 1920s, and again, I'm averaging here per decade because these goes up and down every year for obvious reasons. Sometimes they're dramatic catastrophes, sometimes there's not. In the 1920s, almost 500,000 people died every year from these climate-related disasters. These were huge floods and droughts and catastrophes in China and India and elsewhere. Most of the stuff that you've never heard of. And since then, what's happened is we've seen a dramatic decline. So that the last decade in the 2010s is down to about 14,000 people on average. We're not seeing more and more people die. We're actually seeing dramatically fewer people die, about 98% fewer over the last 100 years. And remember, at the same time, of course, we've become 4 times more people on the planet. So the individual risk of dying has dropped way beyond 99%. Again, why? Because we're rich, because we're smart, because we adapt. And so if you take a look at 2020, and again, you shouldn't put too much into it because it's just 1 year, 2020 was just 14,000. Sorry, I think I said it wrong. It was 18,000 in the 2010s. It was 14,000 in 2020. The last full year we had was 2021. It was even lower, despite, you remember the heat dome that killed 715 people in the US and Canada. You remember the EU floods that killed 205 people. You probably don't remember that more than 1,000 people died in India, or that there were 2 Afghan flash floods that killed more than 300 people. But if you add up all of these, you get less than 7,000. Isn't it amazing that the year where you heard the most catastrophes, it's constant story about how there's just an endless supply of catastrophes in the world from climate. It was one of the lowest numbers we've ever seen. You're not well informed if you just hear these statistics. I don't know, most of you look like you're my age, so you actually remember back in the 90s and the early 2000s, when the media constantly was telling us that, here's a crime, here's a crime, here's a crime. If you asked people, they would all say that crime was increasing. Yet the official numbers clearly showed that crime was actually decreasing. But what was happening was that you were getting more and more television shows, right? And there's obviously enough crime to always fill all channels at all times. So you can easily get the sense that there's more and more crime. I see more and more crime on TV, while real crime was actually declining. I know that the last couple of years are probably different, so I'm not going to get into that whole conversation in the US. But for 20, 25 years, you've had declining levels of crime, yet the impression is that you have more and more crime. This is exactly the same thing that we've seen. Why is that? Why don't we have this understanding? I think we really need to understand that the world looks very different from what we think and hear. I think this is to a very large extent because of our sort of instinct to see all the worst things in life, and because we failed to understand that we're going to adapt. So if you look at flooding, so there's a lot of models that have done flooding. It's very hard to get models that both do with and without adaptation. So this is one of the most quoted papers. It's from 2014, but the research still stands. What they show, and this again is very, very hard to do because they're talking about how many people get flooded. What does it constitute to get flooded? So it's model estimates from 3 different models of flooding, 7 different climate models, and so on. What they find was in 2000, about 3.4 million people were flooded every year. That had a cost of about $11 billion, $13 billion in dike costs, so basically adaptation costs. The total cost, so 11 plus $13 billion, is 0.05% of global GDP. There's 2 points here. One is that this is the starting point, right? Also, that 0.05% is not all that much. Of course, if you're one of the people who are flooded, it's really terrible. But this is not, a catastrophic issue in the world. But let's then look at what happens. What happens if you have a computer that don't quite work? All right, this is more worrisome. At some point, we need to go back to my computer. Okay. No. It's fine. So, all right, I'm just going to page through. So what happens if you have the worst case warming, the highest population, and the highest GDP? So they look at all these scenarios, they give pretty much the same result, but I'm just showing you sort of the worst case scenario for all of this. What happens if you assume that nobody adapts? This happens. You get many, many, many more people that are going to be flooded every year. This is what's been on the cover of New York Times, of Washington Post, every other paper, and this comes out sort of every second year. It's a fairly old result from 2011 that just keeps being recycled. 187 million people are going to be flooded. Half of Europe is going to be flooded, basically. That's obviously not just in Europe, but across the world, right? That's a terrible outcome. 187 million people are going to be flooded. This is going to cost $55 trillion in cost. It's obviously not going to cost very much in dike cost because nobody apparently did anything about that. But overall, it's going to cost more than 5% of GDP. But this assumes a world where we're all standing around and saying, wow, now my knees are wet, now my hip is wet, now I'm starting to drown. Not how real life works, right? It's very convenient if you do modeling, and it makes sense that you do this if you want to compare it to others. I mean, scientifically it makes sense, but telling this to policymakers is just silly. This is not the real world. We don't actually do no adaptation. The $55 trillion is David Wallace-Wells. That was he actually highlighted $110 trillion because that was the high end of that estimate. And you can see why you do this, but it's just not the right estimate. What happens if you actually include adaptation is this, and I'm sorry, you almost can't see it. Oh wait, nobody gets flooded. Adaptation means, and this is sensible, realistic adaptation based on what we usually do, despite the fact that you have almost 3 feet of sea level rise, you will see only 15,000 people flooded by the end of the century. The cost will be $38 billion. It'll be higher because we're much, much richer. There's much more stuff to get damaged, but much less of it will get damaged. You obviously have much higher dike costs because now you're actually doing something about this. Remember, these are all annual costs. But the total cost is going to be 0.008%. What you've actually just seen here is that instead of a world that's getting worse and worse, you have a world that gets better and better. And why? Because people adapt, because people are richer and hence more resilient. It's not rocket science. Now, had we done climate policy, this would have been even better. I can't show this up here on the slide, but instead of 15,000, this would only be 10,000, right? I mean, it would still be just on the zero line here. So climate policy can also help us a little bit. What really matters is that people are rich, that people are resilient, that people are given the resources to make sure that they can adapt. And the important part here is to recognize that we are not going to be in a worse world. We're actually going to be a better world. Instead of flooding costing 0.05% of GDP, it'll now only cost about 1/10 or a little more than 1/10, right? It's going to be much, much better. Had there been no global warming, had there been no sea level rise, this would have been even lower. So we still have a problem, but this is not the end of the world. This is a better and better world, but slightly less better because of global warming. That's a very different approach. And we could also see this in global cost of climate damage. Most people would imagine this has gone up. Again, it's slightly declined. It used to cost about 0.25% of global GDP when you look at all climate-related damages. Now it's down to a little less than 20%. Oh, sorry, 0.20%, of course. So what we're really seeing here is, again, this is not a world that's running out of control. This is a world that actually seems to be better and better, mostly for other reasons. It's not because there's no climate change, but because what really matters is that we become richer, we become more resilient, we're better able to handle these issues. And had there been no global warming, things would probably have gotten even better. But it's a very, very different starting point. It's not the end of the world, it's a problem. So why is it we're not getting this right? Why is it we don't get our climate policies right? I would argue to a very large extent, it's because we have very unrealistic expectations of what's actually possible. So most people think that renewables are pretty soon going to take over and we'll all be happy living in a green world. This is just not reality. If you just look at what's the share of renewable energy in the world over the last couple of centuries. Well, actually in 1800, apart from the UK that got some of its energy from coal, pretty much the entire world was renewable, right? 94% of the world was renewable back in 1800. Over the last 2 centuries, we've spent 2 centuries trying to get rid of renewables, right? Because we actually wanted to get lots and lots and lots of reliable energy. And if you look at since 1970, it's been pretty constant at around 13, 14%. A lot of this is wood use in developing countries. So basically poor people using lots of wood, dung, and cardboard to cook and keep warm inside. What is likely to happen now, and what you also can see the start of here, is in the 2010s, because of a huge policy lift around the world, we've actually seen an increase. So now we're up to about 15% here. And if you look at if all countries in the world were to do all the stuff that they have promised on climate and everything else, up to, well, ta-da, no, now it's back here. So up to 2050, you get this curve. Yeah, it's getting better. Or I don't know if you want to say we're getting to 28% in 2050. But let's just remind ourselves, this is, maybe you should only pay me for when it's on. This is better, clearly, but it's only 28%. So we were going from about 15.7% to about 28%. That's nice, but this is certainly not taking over the world. In 2050, 2/3 of all energy will still come from fossil fuels. If you actually take this, and this is a pretty straight line, contrary to what most people would like you to believe, that renewables are sort of woo, and then they'll just phase in amazingly. It's actually a pretty linear extrapolation, of course, and that's basically because, yes, as you get more and more renewables, it actually becomes harder and harder to appropriate the fact that they're going to be unreliable, and you need a lot of other strategies to make sure that you can contain that. That's probably why it's still not taking off here. And that also means that actually, if you just extrapolate this out, I'm not saying this is a good sort of measure, I'm not saying this is a good way to think about the world, but it's a good measure to think about what's happening, at least in the next 3 decades. We'll only get to 100% in the 23rd century, 2 centuries from now. We have no sense of the idea that we're likely to just switch over to renewables in a couple of decades. People will literally believe, and I think most people, if you ask them, yeah, in 20 years. No, in 20 decades, we'll be at 100% renewable. That's important, again, because that means we need to recognize we're going to have a lot longer to go, and we have a lot harder road, which of course is also why this is going to be so much more costly than what most people think. So if you look at, for instance, there's a new Nature study that looked at how much will it cost per American to go to close to net zero. What they found, this is just one study again, but it was Nature last year, 20% will cost, so reducing 20% will cost $75. This is actually what most Americans say they're willing to pay. So sure, you can get 20%. Getting to 40% will already cost about $500. Most people would not be willing to pay $500 per year to avoid 40% or anything. But 60%, $2,000, probably not. To go to 80% will cost more than $5,000 per person per year by mid-century. and net zero would cost more than $11,000. I think we just have to recognize here, this is just not in the realm of possible. This is not what's going to happen. And of course, one of the points that I will try to make is we're not going to be able to do climate policy on current technologies, on what this suggests. We will need a lot of innovation. So I think it's important to recognize that we're not going to make big differences with the current policies. You probably heard about the Inflation Reduction Act. I actually took the Inflation Reduction Act and what was claimed for it, which is already a little optimistic, and just put it in the UN climate model to see how much of a difference will it make. So this is the standard climate model using SSP2 estimate. So this is the temperature rise that we're likely to see in the climate model over the century. So we'll go from like 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit to almost 5 degrees Fahrenheit. If you plug it in with the absolutely most optimistic outcome, that is that we will, remember the Inflation Reduction Act will run out of money in early 2030s, but assuming that you will still see cuts every year for the rest of the century, which I think is unbelievably unrealistic. But if you do that, you get this outcome instead. I'm sorry, I'm not sure you can see it, but it is there. If you take the more realistic assumption that it will only work as long as there's money, which I think is probably a little too pessimistic, but much more realistic, it gives you this outcome. Yeah, sorry, you can't tell. So I'm gonna enlarge this. So what you can see here, and of course there's no, this is just simply a model outcome, right? But this is the UN climate model, right? It tells you that if we don't do anything, we'll get to 4.8875. You actually need all 4 digits right here. And if you do very optimistic, we'll get to 4.8595. So we'll basically have a temperature reduction of 0.028 degrees Fahrenheit in the most optimistic case. And the most pessimistic case, it'll be 0.0009 degrees Fahrenheit, both of which, of course, will not be measurable in 100 years in real terms. This is just not, this is, you know, people have this idea that, oh, wow, now we've really made a difference. It's true that this is more than what the US has ever done before, but it also tells you how little this will actually make of an impact. Why is this? It's because it doesn't really matter all that much what the US or what Europe does. If the US went entirely net zero today, all of you would have a hard time getting home, but moreover, it would be a really, really terrible world in so many different ways. But imagine the US went net zero today, and for the rest of the century, if you plug that into the UN climate model, it'll reduce temperatures by 0.3 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. Not nothing, but not very much. The US and Europe is just not the things that matter. What matters is what China, India, Africa, the rest of South Asia is going to be emitting over the rest of the century, which is about 3/4 of all emissions. And of course, they are not going to say $11,000 per person per year to cut carbon emissions. Sure, we're going to do that. They have other and bigger priorities, right? So again, we need to get smarter, and that's what I want to talk about, how we think about this. But just before, I just want to emphasize one more thing. I don't know if you guys saw, you know the World Economic Forum, right? In early this year, and they do this every year, and it's wrong every year. But they came out this year and said, what are the most severe global risks for the next 10 years? Not for the next 100 years, for the next 10 years. This was their list. This is in early this year, right? Biodiversity loss was 3rd most important. Extreme weather was 2nd most important. And climate action failure was the most important issue for the next 10 years, right? You got to ask yourself, really? Really? In a world where we're coming out of the worst pandemic in a century, we have recession, possible lots of global inflation, we have an increasingly authoritarian China, I don't know, a Russian invasion of Ukraine. It seems bonkers that people would say the biggest challenge over the next 10 years is lack of climate action. It's not that this is not also a good thing to do, but it's hard not to conclude that we've sort of lost our global marbles here. We just need to get a sense of proportion, right? We should do something about climate, but it's certainly not the most important issue. And as long as we say and claim and argue and behave like it is, we're unlikely to actually make good decisions on this. So how do we make smart climate policy? I mean, climate economics has a fairly good handle on this, and this is why I'm going to spend a little bit of time trying to walk you through this. So the fundamental point, this is what William Nordhaus, the only climate economist to get the Nobel Prize in climate economics, has basically brought to the table is, yes, climate means costly damages, but climate policy also means costly damages. Since we have to pay both, we have to be very careful to find the combination of policy that means the cost of climate and the cost of climate policy is the lowest together. Let me show you what that means. So he's made an estimate of all the different impacts of, and there's a lot of other conversation. This is what generally is found in the literature, but it's not the only thing. And I would love to get into this in the question and answers, but I'm just going to go ahead and talk about what William Nordhaus has done. So he looked at all the different studies. If you look at the temperature increase, and then you see what's the damage cost. So you can see there's a few studies that actually show global warming has a net benefit, but overall, all of them show it has a net cost, which is why global warming is a problem. This is the best line that he found. It's obviously not, there's no way you can get a line through all of these points, but it gives you a good sense of what is probably the impact. So we're estimating that by the end of the century, if we do nothing, we'll probably be around 7 degrees Fahrenheit. So the damage cost will be about 4% of global GDP. This is not nothing, but it's also important to say 4% reduction by the end of the century is not the end of the world, right? Just to give you a sense of proportion, actually. So this is how rich the UN estimate each person in the world is and will be. They have to do this because otherwise we can't predict how much you're going to emit, right? So right now, the world is about $19,000 per person. And by the end of the century, each person in the world will be about 450% as rich as he or she is today. That's an amazing achievement. Of course, it's not different than if you think back in what was life like in the 1940s compared to what's life like today. We're much, much richer, much better off in so many different ways, not just in the rich world, but certainly also in the poor world. So this is what we're likely to see. But because of climate change, we'll be less well off, right? This is not the right estimate. We'll actually be slightly less well off because we'll be 4% less well off. And that emphasizes again the point here. Instead of being 450% as rich by the end of the century, each person in the world will only feel like he or she is 434% as rich. Yes, that's a problem, but no, it's not the end of the world. It's a slightly better, slightly worse, incredibly much better world, right? That's the difference between realizing what we're actually talking about and having this catastrophic issue of thinking about the end of the world. So Nordhaus, this is just a fairly straightforward argument of his model. He basically estimates how much does it cost if we do nothing. If we just get in his model, we end up at 7.4 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. If we do nothing, this is going to cost us about $140 trillion for the world. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of damage. That's certainly something that we should take care of. If we then, with reasonably smart policies, get lower and lower temperatures, the damages get lower and lower. I would argue this is how everyone sees climate. Climate is bad. If we can reduce climate impacts, it gets better or it's less bad. Absolutely true. But it's only half the story. Because getting there means you have climate policy costs. What's the climate policy cost of having no policy? It's zero, right? But if you start having a policy, that is, if you try to get to 6.75 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century, it'll actually cost you something. Not all that much, but probably a couple of, about 20, I think it's $18 trillion. If you try to get lower, it'll cost you almost $100 trillion. If you try to get even lower, you can end up spending a very, very large amount of resources on the world. The point here is to recognize they're both cost to climate and to climate policy. So not surprisingly, you actually have to add all these up. This was the climate cost I showed you. This is what we all agree on. But you have to add the climate policy cost. So there's no addition to the no policy. then there's the $18 trillion here, then there's the $100 trillion here, and more, right? If you see this, and we never talk about this, you see very obviously what climate economists would argue, namely that this is the optimal outcome. This is actually where the world has the least both damage costs from climate and damage costs from climate policy. You can't just talk about one without the other. Now, you can obviously argue, are these numbers exactly right and all that stuff, and that is a huge discussion that we can have. But you can't argue with the principle, and of course, this is basically what William Nordhaus got the Nobel Prize for. We don't have that conversation, and we don't have it. I think that's one of the reasons why we don't think smartly about climate. He would argue we should have an increase in carbon tax, and that would be a smart thing. It would not solve very much of climate change, but it would solve a little bit of it, and it would solve it optimally. And that's why I think, and then I'll shut up, so we actually have time to engage in Q&A. So what we found in the center when we work on climate issues is basically that there's some very obvious things that you shouldn't do. So one of the big things and one of the best analyzed things is the EU 2020 climate policy, which was 20% reduction by 2020 under 1990 levels. They had a lot of other 20s because it sounded really good. But fundamentally, this was what came out. If you spend $1 on this, and it was fairly costly climate policy, it didn't have very much impact, but it did have a little bit of impact on the temperature in the future. It would reduce global damages in the future. It would reduce so much global damages that for every $1 you spend, you will avoid about 3 cents of climate damage. Now, that's not bad. You've actually done some good in the world, but obviously you could have spent that $1 and just given it away to poor people, and they would have gotten a whole $1. They would have been 97 cents better off. We didn't do that. This was bad policy, right? Paris Agreement, slightly better, but still not very good. For every $1 we spend, we probably do about 11 cents of climate good. The reason why it's better is because we actually really believe we got China and India and everybody else involved, and since it's cheaper to cut carbon emissions there, it's actually better than just having rich countries cut their carbon emissions. As I showed you also, if you do a smart global carbon tax, not a fantastic smart, but a reasonably smart one, like you could actually imagine happening, that would actually be good. It wouldn't be very high, it wouldn't solve very much of the problem, but it would have significant cost, but the benefits would be even greater. So for every $1 spent, you'd do about $2 worth of good. But the fundamental point, and what we found, so we worked with 28 of the world's top climate economists and 3 Nobel laureates to try to find out where can you actually spend $1 and do the most good for climate. Their overwhelming point was this is all about innovation. Why? Because if you have a really big problem, it's very, very hard to tell people, we're going to solve this by all of you guys feeling a little uncomfortable for the rest of your lives. That's not surprisingly doesn't sell a lot of tickets, right? You can't tell people, I'm sorry, could you be a little poorer and be, freeze a little more in the winter, but sweat a little more in the summer and stop eating all the hamburgers and drive a little less and all that stuff. First of all, it doesn't matter very much. I mean, we did this during COVID and it had virtually no impact, right? But secondly, it is really hard to get people to do this in the long run, which of course is why we're not actually achieving very much with climate impact. But if you could innovate green energy to be cheaper than fossil fuels, everyone would switch. Imagine, so Bill Gates, for instance, is investing in 4th generation nuclear, which basically promised to be incredibly cheap and incredibly safe. Of course, that's what they said about the other 3 generations. So let's be a little skeptical about this. But the point is, if we actually got these smart little reactors that would just produce power with no CO2 and incredibly cheap, we'd be done. Everyone would just buy them. You wouldn't have to force China or India or anybody else to do it. We'd just do it because it was cheaper. And it's the same thing with all kinds of innovations. We do them if we could make them cheaper. And this is how we've solved all problems in the past. If you think to the 1960s, 70s, we worried enormously about India. It was actually not Africa back then. We worried about India and most of Southeast Asia, that they were just simply running out of food. There were just way too many people, way too little food that was not going to end well. The solution back then, sort of the climate solution, would be to say, let's all make an agreement here. You guys are all going to eat a little less, and then we're going to send all the food down to India. Right? And of course, that doesn't work. What did work was innovation. We had the Green Revolution. We have people that innovated little seeds that suddenly gives you 3 times as much food per acre. And that's why India has gone from a basket case to now being the world's leading rice exporter. If you think about another issue, in Los Angeles in the 1950s, terribly polluted place. And it was mostly because of cars, and where Los Angeles is, but you can't really move that, right? So how do you fix that? Again, the sort of standard climate solution would be to tell every Los Angelino, what is it? Yeah. Tell them, I'm sorry, just leave your car and run or walk instead. And of course, that would never happen, right? But the real solution was the innovation of the catalytic converter. You get this little gizmo. Yeah, it costs them a couple $100. You put it on the tailpipe, and then you can basically drive as long as you want and pollute much, much less. That's what has solved, I'm not saying Los Angeles is fine, but it's much, much cleaner than what it used to be. Technology solves these issues, and that's why we found that green energy innovation is by far the best investment, because we can invest in a lot of these different technologies. Most of them are not going to come through. You know, Bill Gates' innovation might never come through. There's a lot of other similar ideas, but we really just need one or a few of them to come through, because those are the ones that'll power the 21st century. So let's try to be smart about how we actually deal with climate change. I would argue this is very simple and straightforward, but we can only get that conversation once we get off this, it's the end of the world, we got to do something, right? Once we get there, we can start having a conversation about how do we fix this problem, just like we fix most other problems. We don't do it by panicking. We don't do it by spending lots of money on things that we know doesn't work and are likely not to work at least in the next coming decades. We do this through innovation, like we solve most other problems. I would love to talk to you about all the other stuff I do, but you know, we'll take a little bit in the question and answer. Thank you very much, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Chris, do you want to just pass around the microphone as people, so yeah, so a lot of people in the room would be a little hard. Before, as you think about a question, let me just start with one here on this slide. So when you say $1 in green energy innovation leads to $11 in return, who's spending this dollar? Are you suggesting government sort of like subsidies?
Yes.
Or...
So no, not subsidy. So remember, the reason why there's an underinvestment in innovation is that it's very hard to imagine that you can recoup most of your private costs in the long run. This is why we invest a lot in medical research, this kind of stuff that makes Nobel Laureates in medical science. It's because it's 40 years out, right? Once you finally get the medication that's going to make us all, you know, that's going to make Pfizer or someone else rich, the patent has run out. So there's a huge benefit for public in investing in these kinds of forward-looking, far-out ideas that won't get generated by private companies. If you give private companies money, they're going to make their next year's model better. You know, so you're going to make a slightly better wind turbine or whatever it is that you're selling. And that's all great, but they'll do that by themselves because they have a financial incentive to do that. What we need is to have people invest in the stuff that you don't quite think is going to work out. So there's a good case, for instance, for fracking. So Breakthrough Institute has made a good sort of survey of what was actually that happened. Mitchell, who was very central to fracking here in Texas, was very clear that most of this happened because he had this idea. Nobody else really thought it was going to work, and DARPA gave him money to try to follow up on this. And eventually it worked, and it was great for everyone. Of course, remember, if you spend money on stuff that's going to be amazing, you'll only hear about the great stories afterwards. Or if you have political interest, you'll hear about the bad stuff, right? But fundamentally, you need to spend money on a lot of things that won't work. That's fine. But the point is, researchers are cheap. This does not mean we should invest in cylinders, right? We should not actually invest in production, because that's just going to get you in problem. But invest in researchers. Just one more story. Craig Venter, you might have heard of him. He was the guy who cracked the human genome back in 2000. He has this amazing idea, and it doesn't work, right? Not right now. So he's envisioning, imagine taking gene-modified algae, putting them out on the ocean surface. Out there, they'll soak up sunlight and CO2 and produce oil. Then we just harvest them and keep our entire fossil fuel economy running, but now CO2 free because they just soaked up the CO2 out in the ocean, right? We could actually all grow our own oil. You know, Saudi Arabia is out on the ocean surface, and just keep our entire economy running with no CO2. How cool would that be? Now, it doesn't work. Well, it works in the laboratory and we can get it to work, but it's not anywhere near cost effective. But that's it with all these kinds of ideas. Let's give him a little bit of money, not a lot. It's not a cylinder, right? But give him a couple $1 million to keep this running and see if he can work it out. And of course, if he does, he's going to be a fantastically rich man, and we're going to be incredibly grateful because we'll all be able to live off of this idea. And there's 1,000 ideas just like that, and we really just need a few of them. So that's why technology and innovation is such powerful ideas. It's about making sure that we get these solutions in the future. Now, if everyone thinks that the end is coming, and this is not unreasonable, but AOC worrying about, we're going to run out, we're all going to die in 12 years or whenever, it just doesn't make sense to, invest in this. I get that, but that's why we need to reel back the doomsday so that we can actually understand, look, this is a long-term issue. This is something we need to fix in the 21st century. Let's fix it smartly. No, Nick.
The mic's coming. There we go.
So just following up on that last point, you said that we need to give these people with good ideas a little bit of money to keep them going so that we get a few winners. But I'm still confused, and maybe this is what Carlos was saying. Who's the we? Who's doing the picking?
So I would argue,
money. I know who's paying, but who's doing the picking?
So I would argue that, and that was what our Nobels were proposing. Right now, the world spends about $15 billion on investment in green energy R&D. That's a very, very little. It's much, much less than we spend on pretty much any other technology. At the Paris Agreement, Obama and most other world leaders and Bill Gates and a lot of these billionaires from the Giving Pledge came together and actually promised that they were going to double that. Of course, we didn't actually do that because it doesn't look all that amazing to do this. We're actually arguing that we should get up to about $100 billion, so much more, but still, about 6 times as much as what the world is giving. This would still be only 1/10 of what we're spending every year on solar and wind. So it'd be much, much less. You're also asking then, how should we be spending it? I think this, there's a lot of different ways you'd want to do this in different nations. I'm envisioning, so we were arguing that you should give 0.01% of GDP to R&D. So rich countries would give more, and everyone decide how they're going to give it to green energy research. Some, in Denmark, probably we'd give a lot to how to make better wind turbines. Some countries are going to give it all to nuclear because they're good at that. Some are going to give it to fusion. Some are going to give it to a lot of different ways. I think you use the National Science Foundation's model. People imagine making blue ribbon panels on what are the most pressing things we want to get solved over the next 10 years. So you come up with like 100 things we'd like to solve. And then people ask for money on those 100 things. I'm going to be the guy who solves number 87 or whatever that is. And, so it's a $300,000 grant to get further to solving that problem. Some of them will solve, some of them we won't. Some of them will actually lead somewhere, we'll actually, get richer. Some of them won't. And again, the point here is to get to a point where renewables or green energy is so cheap that it will become investable by regular companies to say, I'm going to commercialize that idea. Sorry, yes.
Just the microphone, just so that there's folks at home that want to listen to you.
I'm usually pretty loud. It's usually okay. Isn't that what's happening right now? Isn't that what's happening with wind and solar becoming cheaper than fossil fuels in many cases?
Yes.
I mean, and isn't that what the IRA is trying to do, or is it not trying to do that?
So a lot of people will tell you, if you spend $100 billion on solar and wind, let's just say wind turbines, of course you're going to get better wind turbines because you've just given $100 billion away to private companies that are obviously going to invest this in R&D. And our best estimates, and these are not very good, is that they will invest about 6% of this. So You give away $100 billion. You basically get $94 billion of wind turbines you already know are not effective. And then you get $6 billion spent on getting better wind turbines. I'm simply saying, well, if you wanted better wind turbines, maybe you should give in all the $100 billion on innovation. So the whole point here is to recognize it's not about making next year's model better off. I know that Vestas, sorry, I'm just making, that's the Danish wind turbine maker. Not that they like me very much, but yeah, so they're going to make the next year's wind turbine better off. It's about making the breakthrough technologies that'll power us in 20 or 40 years from now. And first of all, I'm not sure that Vestas is thinking all that much about it. I'm not sure that most businesses that are already in business will be the right ones to make that happen. But it's certainly not how you do this if you want to focus on all of the different technological breakthroughs. Then you need a different model where you're spending less money, but much more smartly.
First of all, I'd like to agree with the sentiment that we can't go forward by taking steps backward. I never have seen capitalism evolve by people saying, let's cut spending or let's just stop being so greedy. I don't think that any of the circumstances happening right now are driven by greed, but rather by necessity. Before, like you mentioned, we were burning stool or wood, and now we're having much cleaner burning fuels. And so I guess I was just wondering, innovation is a very fat tail event, right? It doesn't happen very frequently. It's a black swan, and it takes a special eye to identify it. And so, that's up to maybe Silicon Valley venture capital firms in the United States. And so I was wondering, how do you justify them being the authority on this, given their sort of conflict of interest in the past, where they don't really consider the company's valuations? And I'm taking a very business-oriented perspective on this. But a lot of Silicon Valley investors do it for the optics rather than looking at effective innovations, which is why it leads to them investing in effective companies. And then the second part of it is, how do you actually get legislation that puts effective innovation in place, like for catalytic converters or even for seat belts? Those are innovations that may have existed for a while, but it took a while for them to be adopted. So I guess those are my two questions.
Yes. So first of all, the argument is not that we're going to get a lot of Silicon Valley companies doing this. Again, what they do is great, but that's sort of within the existing framework. If you think about the COVID vaccine, most of it got, I guess. It was basically an innovation that had been 40 years in the coming. It's several Nobel Laureates have been produced during this. And the idea is you need to be able to take a lot of smart people a long time ago that came up with ideas that eventually could be commercialized by Pfizer and others, and brought to bear for a very large proportion of humanity. That's how you do innovation. You do a lot of stuff that really just makes sense if you're in a little academic circle, and eventually some of this will be commercializable. Is that a word? Commercializable? It should be. And then you can actually bring it to market, and we're all going to be better off for it. That's the right way to do it. And I'm simply pointing out that we have no problem doing this in healthcare. All of us understand, it's also a little bit because we all know that we're going to get old, right? And get sick and all that stuff. So we want to spend a lot of money on researchers figuring out all kinds of stuff that will eventually, probably not going to help us, but help our kids and grandkids live longer lives. We just need the same thing in energy. And in that sense, it's not rocket science. So, sorry, what was the other part? Right, the legislation. So I think it's really very simple. We're right now spending almost $1 trillion on green energy. So mostly solar and wind, mostly stuff that we would never put up had we not had very strong policy incentives to do so. We should spend much, much less. So we're proposing about $100 billion, but spend it much smarter through research and development. Of course, that'll be hard to do because a lot of these people, a lot of these companies are giving away very large sums of money to politicians to make sure that they stay in business. But we need to say, no, let's actually do cheaper stuff that's much more effective and will actually lead to a solution for the problem rather than just us, essentially buying greenwashing.
Chris?
The question I ask is, what happens if we get a volcano like we had in 1815, where the sun didn't shine in the northern hemisphere for almost 2 years to wind and solar.
Well, I'm not sure wind would be all that effective, but clearly solar would be terribly effective. And I think the sort of larger point of what you're asking is that there's a lot of things that could go wrong in the world. There's Carrington event. We could have, pretty much all of our technology roasted by solar storm. We could have a super volcano. We could have all kinds of terrible outcomes. And it seems like we're only preparing for one thing, namely climate change. That's not a very sustainable way forward. Actually, if you think about it, what did people 100 years ago, so in 1922, what did they think were going to be the biggest problems in 2022? If they had any thoughts, they were probably wrong, right? There's a wonderful book called Today Then about the 1892 World Fair in Chicago, where they asked a lot of really smart people, what do you think is going to happen in 100 years? And then they published it 100 years later. It's very entertaining reading. They're all very, very happy they're all going to be dead when it's published. And they were mostly wrong. And some of it was right, but in the wrong kind of way. And, they were imagining that we would have, email was these gigantic pneumatic tubes that would run underneath the ocean. And so you could, do you remember? No, I remember that. That's actually gives away my age, right? But you put in a message and then it would sort of go into this tube. It would be sucked out, and then, go somewhere else. It's kind of email if you think about it in 1800 terms, right? But that was not how email happened. But the fundamental point is they were mostly wrong. If we had asked them to spend lots and lots of money on helping us today, we probably have wasted most of that resources, which is why we normally don't do that. How do we basically help future generations? We do it with two things. We make sure they're richer, that is, they're better off, they're more able to deal with whatever happens, and they have more knowledge. Those are the things that we deliver to our kids and grandkids. We give them more knowledge, more capital, and then we basically say, let them fend for themselves. Because we don't know what the big problem is going to be. And I think that's really the essence of your question, that we have so focused on one issue that we've forgotten. Even that issue will probably mostly be fixed by people being richer and more resilient. Remember, if a hurricane hits Florida, yeah, it's a terrible thing, but some people are going to die. It's going to certainly impact Florida GDP for a month or so, and then it's pretty much over. If the same kind of hurricane hits Guatemala, it's, it'll kill tens of thousands of people and destroy the economy for years on end. That's the difference between being rich and poor. The point is not to help these people in Guatemala and elsewhere by saying, you know what, we're going to not drive our SUV. So yes, you'll get stronger hurricanes. Yes, it's going to be worse for you, but slightly less, much worse by the end of the century. That's not the way to go. We'll lift you out of poverty. We'll actually make sure you get rich, that you get educated, all these other things that will actually help these people. I think that's the fundamental point, that we help the world in the ways that make a difference so that they can tackle all the different problems.
Thank you for being here. Welcome to Texas. I've got two questions. First is about carbon tax. And I'd like to segue with the Mitchells, that you mentioned George Mitchell, to thinking about Texas, particularly in climate change. You have written, in favor of a carbon tax, and I like it very much. Milton Friedman talked about negative externalities. We certainly have negative externalities, pollution from our fossil fuels. So there is a bill, HR 2307, which provides for a carbon fee and dividend, so that the dividend would go back to the people to offset the increased cost. And it also has a border adjustment, cross-border adjustment, would you refer to an international carbon tax. Europe is moving on that. And in Texas, if we don't do something, our manufacturers will end up paying a tax to those foreign governments. The Mitchell Foundation has funded a program or a report called Texas to Net Zero, done by UT. And he's the man who made fracking work, as you said, but they believe, the foundation and the family, that we've gone as far as we can with natural gas. So Texas needs to move towards a carbon-free economy. And they also believe that that will be positive for our economy. And part of that is the carbon tax that's hanging out there and will sooner or later come about. So in Texas, we have climate change issues. We have a 2.2 degree, according to the Texas A&M report called the Assessment of Historic and Future Trends of Extreme Weather, which is available online. We have a 2.2 degree average temperature per day higher now than we did in the 1880s. They expect that by 2036, this report was for 2036, that our average temperature in the summers will be equivalent to our hottest today. So that our hottest summers will be the typical summer of 2036. We have extensive drought in West Texas. We're kind of the eastern edge of the mega drought that's been reviewed in peer-reviewed articles in Science and in Nature. And we have many dead pool rivers that aren't running. The Falcon and other lakes are very low in their elevation. We have a growing population, and our water issues are very real. We have clean air issues. All of our major metropolitan areas have had over 100 days of bad air quality each of the last several years. With population increase in use of fossil fuel, that's going up. So there are other issues, but with hurricanes and coastal subsidence and that sort of thing. So Texas is hit very hard by climate change issues. So I wonder if you might think with me about carbon tax and dividend program and what Texas should do to both mitigate and adapt for climate change. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. So I think there's a couple of things here. It's important to recognize what a carbon tax can and cannot do. So any realistic carbon tax is only going to be a small part of the solution in the sense of actually fixing all of climate change. So you're talking about going net zero by 2050, and as most sort of the policy conversation and the world is really talking about, which I think you just got to say out loud is just free fantasy. It's just the Saudi minister said, now he's not an independent or unbiased participant, but he said that's just la la land number 2, right? That's just not in the real world going to happen. That's also what I tried to show you up there. I think we have a totally unrealistic sense of what's going to happen. So any economist will tell you absolutely a carbon tax is the rational way to fix this problem. But remember 2 things. Partly, it's only going to fix a smaller part of global warming. And then the economists would say, and then you're done. Stop doing anything else. Don't do any other thing. Now, you're talking about the redistribution part. Most economists would say that's a separate issue. I mean, you can absolutely have that conversation. I see how it makes it politically more palatable, but it's a totally different conversation. It's really a redistribution conversation, which is politically fine conversation, but it has very little to do with the climate bit of the impact. And that's why I think we really have to be realistic in saying what has actually happened right now. We're estimating the correct carbon price is somewhere between $30 and $60. The actual carbon price in the world is $1. So it's $80 in Sweden, but it's 0 most places on most things. In the OECD, we have a couple of thousand different carbon taxes, which just shows you how hard this is going to be. And so my point is, I think there's an issue to say this is the correct sort of academic impact, but it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be the main part of the solution. And I think in some places, certainly the US, it seems like focusing too much on a carbon tax is actually just going to make it almost impossible to do anything smart. And that's why I'm saying, yes, it's a good idea. Let's actually try to focus on the smartest thing first. It's both cheaper, it's much more effective, and it's more likely to actually happen. So that would be my 2 cents on that.
Yep, you go ahead.
So you iterated how the US shouldn't be moving hard and fast toward a net zero emissions future because countries like India and China aren't going to be like hurrying to keep up with that. And so when you're talking about how there has to be a balance of policy and also just like restraint there, how do you imagine other countries cooperating and like doing their share there? And also I have one more question. How do you see, as you see people getting wealthier, how do you imagine that money can go from corporations and consumers to, say, developing countries?
Okay, I'll answer the first question, and then I'll just ask you because I'm not quite sure I understand the second part. But the first part, fundamentally, I'm not trying to make the argument because somebody else is not going to do anything, we shouldn't do anything. I'm simply trying to argue why the US doing something will actually have a surprisingly small impact. And I think if most people knew this, they'd be much more likely to say, what? Am I going to be spending my money on that tiny impact? Maybe we could be spending it better elsewhere. I think we need to have a more realistic conversation. People talk about net zero in 2050 like it was something we can decide to happen. It's just not going to happen. It may just with a lot of cheating happen in a few countries, in Western Europe and maybe a few states in the US, and that's about it. And remember, why is, for instance, Britain is one of the countries that have had the largest reduction in their CO2 emissions? Why? Because they basically deindustrialized. And so, yes, if you live off of banking and have all the rest of the world do everything for you, sure, you can be very low CO2, but obviously it's not a sustainable solution for everyone. It's basically just a way to feel good about yourself. I'm not, they have done a little bit of good, but a lot of it is just, makeup and pretend. So we need to recognize that we shouldn't do stuff just because we think we need to do it in order to get everybody else to do it. Remember, it's not like Germany, who's perhaps the leading exponent of trying to do green good, is inspiring most of the rest of the world to say, yes, I want to be in the same position as Germany is right now. Most people run away from that. I think, and I think correctly so, Germany has increasingly become a how not to do it example. And so we should very much try not to be that, but to actually be leading by positive example. I'm unsure of what you meant by giving from companies to consumers.
Oh, yes. So you were talking someone over there about like the humanitarian impact of like maybe we'll be having more natural disasters, but humanity is going to adapt. And then there's that concern, like, do developing countries have the resources to adapt their infrastructure? And I may have misheard, but I think you were going on a point about how we can assist those kinds of.
Okay, yes, all right. So the simple point here is, again, I'm struck by, and you see this a lot of times, people will worry about how, for instance, people were suffering in Pakistan from the heat wave or from the flooding, and they will sort of assume that's because of global warming, which is already somewhat dubious, but let's just go with that. And then say, I'm gonna help these people, these poor people, by not driving my SUV to work tomorrow. And I'm like, what? You're gonna help them absolutely nothing? Is that your, was that the impression that you were actually gonna do? These guys have lots and lots of very real problems where we could help them a lot more, better food, better education, get rid of easily curable infectious diseases, those kinds of things. If we want to help, let's make sure we actually help by making countries better off. And so if you're going to spend money on trying to do good, make sure you do it in the way that'll actually help these countries instead of just mostly making yourself feel good about what you're doing.
So if I interpreted correctly, I sense that things that the IPC says with confidence or whatever their high ranking thing is, you think is reasonable. And so
yeah.
we can agree there's a significant increase in temperature and there's going to be a rise in sea level over the long term. What I worry about is when you when you look at the implications of those events, that they are going to have a disproportionate impact on the people with a low GDP.
Yep.
So when you go through the math of trying to understand what the cost is of that climate implication, the cost is low because none of these people have anything to begin with. And so it becomes kind of an unclear argument to me when I see a lot of people potentially being screwed by that situation. And it seems to be distorted by the fact that those with high GDPs can certainly mitigate out of the problem. So I wonder if you could just comment on that and whether my logic is off there.
No, there's certainly something to that. So what you have to remember is that when these people are going to be hit, so absolutely, mostly global warming is about hurting poor people. So sorry, that came out wrong. It sounded like I wanted to do that. Global warming will mostly harm the world's poor. But remember, when most of this damage will hit, they will be much, much richer. Now, we'll be even richer than that, but will likely be much less of a difference. So it's not quite as bad as what you're imagining in the impact. But remember, the reason why poor people are most vulnerable, it's a little bit because they live where it's already hot. So it's actually worse from climate, but mostly it's because it sucks to be poor. You know, everything hurts poor people more. So they're more vulnerable to disease, they're more vulnerable to terrorism, they're more vulnerable to bad education, to pretty much anything else that you can think of. And so most of the other solutions that are available for them are also much, much cheaper for them. So if you were to spend money to try to mitigate any of these problems, it would be very hard, for instance, or it'd be very expensive to raise the average living age in the US a year. But it'd be much, much cheaper in many of these other places because it would be much cheaper diseases. It'd be much more direct ways to help. And that's true across all of these areas. So in reality, what you're really talking about is it the right pricing that we're talking about relative to all the other problems that you want to intervene? And there, the argument would be, yes, it is, actually. But it's also a question of saying, so my argument here is simply to say, do you want to fix climate change smartly, or do you want to fix climate change stupidly? And now, obviously, when I put it like this, nobody's going to say, I want to fix it stupidly. But we seem to be insisting on trying to do it badly because we have this catastrophic sense in mind. And that's, I think, why the sort of standard argument in the rich world has become, we want to have more solar and wind, which at best is just going to be a tiny part of the solution, and typically at a rather high cost. And so I'm simply trying to talk about, are there other and smarter ways that we could do that? And the answer is yes, we could help them with all their other problems, and we could help them more effectively through innovation. And we could also recognize that actually lifting people out of poverty is probably the long-term best thing we can do, because that will save them not only from climate change, or save them significantly from climate change, but also all the other problems that the world is likely to have, or that we could potentially be envisioning. Remember, we seem to be worrying about a very thin sliver of issues. So the effective altruism guys, they've sort of gone a little bit off and worrying about.
A little bit. They've gone a lot. I mean, sorry.
But they've gone off and talking about, what is existential crises? Existential things that could wipe out humanity. I think that, there's some really interesting stuff there. The idea of gray goo taking over the world, or AI, that kind of thing. I'm not an expert in these things, but I think, what they're basically telling us is, if you actually worry about these, what could really wipe out humanity, they're much, much bigger things than global warming. And one of the things is that if we have richer and more resilient people, we'll be much more likely to be able to deal with that in all kinds of ways. And that's certainly true also for the world's poorest. So my general point is, there is something to this, but I think most of it is mitigated by the fact that it's also much cheaper to help them in all kinds of ways, the world's poor, and that it also is a question of making sure that we find the right solutions, that it's the solutions that will help them also at the end of the century.
Let me also point out that you mentioned the importance of thinking about not only the cost of climate change, but the cost of policy to address climate change. When you put it together, you see what the optimal point is. And that's exactly he's focusing on the cost to climate change to the poor. Well, how about the cost of the policy to the poor? The cost of the policy to the poor is also going to be disproportional. If you make energy expensive across the world, Bangladesh, Brazil, Guatemala will suffer a lot more than us. So that's again something you have to think about.
I want to say that. So what he said.
Hi, I was just curious, you talked a lot about green energy innovation and investing in research. I was curious on your thoughts about carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, and whether you thought that was like a viable, long-term, large-scale option, and if that's something like smart to invest in.
Yeah, so very clearly, we should be investing in all kinds of ways that we could solve this problem. So carbon sequestration, absolutely. The thing that talks against it, and again, remember, I'm not a science guy in that way, so I've talked to a lot of these guys who do it, but from the economist point of view, is that it'll always be an extra cost. So unlike, if you come up with, if you perfect fusion, cool, we'll all be rich and, we'll all stop worrying about climate change. But if you get carbon capture to be really cheap, you still have to sell this to the rest of the world. Right now it costs what, 30 trillion to do this per year, which basically means nobody's going to do it, right? A third of global GDP. Imagine if you could make it incredibly cheap, then it'll only cost us $400 billion a year. That's still a lot of money, right? I think, and so Roger Pilger points out, if we make it sufficiently cheap, it stopped being this huge international issue. If it costs $400 billion a year, I can almost imagine Europe just saying, all right, look, guys, we're going to pay for it, and let's get this over with. So yes, there is a point to it, but it's harder to sell because it'll never get sufficiently effective.
Sorry, now we'll go to you.
Hi, my name is Sahas. I'm a student at the Policy Research Laboratory at Salem Center. You mentioned in one of the graphs that if there was no adaptation by 2100, that it would cost 55 trillion in flood costs. But if there was adaptation, it would cost 38 billion in flood costs. So what if adaptation is driven by, like the earlier question asked, carbon capture and utilization storage technology, CDR, carbon dioxide removal technology, or negative emissions technologies? And when we look at innovation, it's happening in these spaces. And who's innovating it? It's these major oil and gas companies, whether it's ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, or Shell. And what's accelerating the deployment of these technologies? Well, it's federal policy, like you mentioned, the IRA or the 45Q tax credit. So then from this side, it does look like climate policy, especially in the US, is making a big impact in the deployment of these new technologies. And like you mentioned, well, sure, the US doesn't really need it, but what if it's developed in the US, but later distributed all across the world for India and China?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, if you spend money on climate policy, obviously, unless you spend it really badly, you will get something out of it. So absolutely, it is likely that the IRA is going to make some good. The question is how much good at what price? And I think that's much, much less clear. It seems to me that most of it is just going to be spent on stuff we already know is not going to work. But yes, it will do some good. Vaclav Smil likes to point out that if we actually wanted to get, for instance, carbon capture storage to work, it would take us building up the same infrastructure as we already have for oil, but for something that would be absolutely worthless, except for us saying that we'd like to get rid of it. And I struggle, so he struggles to see, but I also struggle to see that this is a viable political solution. So yes, it can be part of the solution, but I worry that it's probably not going to be a big part of it. And again, what we should be funding is not a lot of companies trying to get rid of the extra tons, because that's going to be incredibly expensive. We should fund the guys who come up with amazing ideas and how to do it on an exponential, I hate that word, a dramatically more cost-effective way than what we're currently doing. That's the way you're going to get big advances. I don't really see us, just paying for a lot of these. We've had a lot of these white elephants where we're paying companies billions of dollars to, basically do more of these demonstration plants that work fairly poorly, and we already knew we could do that.
The estimate that green energy innovation yields an 11-fold return is seems quite optimistic. I'm wondering what you looked at in the past to arrive at this estimate for the future.
Yes. So first of all, we should be absolutely clear. It's impossible to say what you're going to get out of the future because we're essentially talking about stuff we haven't innovated. If we had it, we'd already know it, right? That's the sort of Popper argument. So this is obviously based on other investments. One of the best sustained research that we have of investment in R&D is in yield enhancements. So we know that if you spend more money on researchers tinkering with seeds, you get higher yields. And you know that there's a very linear increase. Get more researchers, you get higher yields. And it's not a jump curve. It's not like, oh, then you innovate and then suddenly we have 3 times more. That's very rare that we see that. It's sort of more a systemic 1% increase over for every year. So that was one of the very motivating parts. It actually turns out that they have much higher benefit cost ratios. So they're like 30 or 35 or 40 possibly even, sustained over many years for global industry. And that's one of the reasons why we should be investing in that. Totally big aside. But it's also a question, so the authors who did this, and again, there's no way this is a true estimate, 11. It's a ballpark measure more than anything else. They also looked at the policy costs that we could avoid. That is, if policies, for instance, in Europe are set, we're going to reduce carbon emissions by 55%, come hell and high water, and that's going to be incredibly expensive. The Biden kind of promises that we're going to get net zero by 2050. That'll lead to very high costs. If you then can imagine with a certain probability that you'll have a technology that'll make it less costly or perhaps even advantageous 20 years sooner, that will lead to dramatic reductions in policy costs. And that was also included, which I think is a reasonable way to estimate it. But again, there's a lot of assumptions that go into this. I'm not going to say that this is a true number. It's a ballpark estimate.
All right, time for one more question. Oh, sorry, Greg, I didn't see you. No, you and then Greg, and then we'll close.
So I was going to take the opportunity to close this out actually, and just, but it doesn't have to be a closer. So you've got what we've discussed is maybe an optimistic 11 times investment prediction for green energy innovation, and that's the gold standard, much better than a carbon tax. But if you were to just put the climate debate into the context of other places we might spend money, can we do better than 11 to 1, and where?
Yes. So I'm sorry, I'm just going to run through a lot of these slides that I didn't show. So did you get smarter now? No, so I'm just going to show you. So this is what we've actually done. We did this so these are all cost benefit analyses for a lot of different things for the world. We did this for the Sustainable Development Goals. It was the only cost benefit analysis done systematically across all areas in the UN. And what you can see here is there's an amazing number of different things that we can do, and we didn't do all of them. And what you find here is, for instance, universal access to contraception up here is a great investment, mostly because it generates a push towards getting a demographic dividend. If you get slightly fewer kids, most of the problem with kids in the developing world is spacing. And once you space kids better, you also end up having slightly fewer of them because you run out of runway, so to speak. And that means that you will invest more in each kid. They will become more productive. There'll be more productive services. There'll be more capital for them. And so they'll actually be richer. And that means that for every dollar spent, you'll do $120 worth of good. If you get free of trade, you can actually get about $2,000 back in the dollar. If you focus on tuberculosis, TB, you get $43 back. If you get more migration, you get $45. Remember, this is a very economist point of view, right? Because it doesn't include the social costs, which are real ones. If you reduce child malnutrition, you can also do $45 worth of good, basically because if you get kids better fed, their brains develop more. So when they go to school, they learn more, then hence they become more productive when they're adults and increase the growth rate of the economy. If you triple preschool in sub-Saharan Africa, you can do $33. There's a lot of different things you can do. If you look at climate change here, more energy research is 11. Climate change adaptation is 2. The 2-degree target is less than 1, probably much less than 1. So, you know, there's, and what we try to do when we show this to policymakers is basically just say, look, lots of things you can choose from. Please choose one of the long lines, right? So this is not rocket science. It's not about saying that there's something that's right and something that's wrong. It's much more about saying when the economic literature tells you there's something that is incredibly effective and there's something that's pretty dumb, you should choose the incredibly effective first.
So I started the day by saying something about we are a free market center, and I cannot help but notice that one of the lines there are orders of magnitude larger.
Yes.
Can you speak a little bit about that?
So I actually feel, so we're actually doing an update of this, so don't tell anyone and let's just switch off the, no. So we're coming up with an update on the free trade. It's too large. And that's
it's smaller than that.
Yeah, yes, and that's because, so the estimate back then was what's the cost? And the main cost is you have to pay off Western farmers to get this through. And I think that's probably too small of a cost because you actually also have to recognize that there's going to be a lot of adaptation cost for a lot of people. You know, there's real cost involved in transferring. So the Obama administration at one point had an estimate that about a fifth of the benefits of trade is lost to other people. This was a US estimate, and you know it's probably a high-end estimate and certainly not reflective of the world, but you need a higher cost. I think the real answer is it's probably in the 80s or 90s or something. So we'll come out with
still a long line.
It's a very long line. Right. And the point here is it's not a competition about, you know, who gets to be 40 long and who gets to be 80 long. They're both amazing. Let's do them, right? We're you know, environmentalists like to say, and I think that's absolutely true, just because there's something else like TB doesn't mean we shouldn't also do climate. Look, we're an advanced species. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We should do more things, and we are doing more things. But there's actually two things that I think stand out. Climate sucks out the oxygen from almost any other thing. It's actually not such that most people who talk about climate also talks about all kinds of other things. They almost only talk about climate. And so, yes, we should get back to talk about many different things. And then, of course, if we are stupid on climate, that is, we end up spending lots of resources very ineffectively, it literally means there's a lot of other money that's not available to all the smart things that we could otherwise do. That's why it's important we do smart stuff in climate so that we also have a lot of money left over to all the other smart stuff we should do. So, you know, I think this is not about saying, you know, is yours, I have these conversations where people are like, I'm 80 and oh, you're just 40. Look, I mean, the point is you're all amazing investments. We should do the amazing investments first.
Well, let's thank Bjorn again. And just to wrap up, on November 3rd, we'll be here in this room having a net zero debate featuring Alex Epstein and a professor that was sitting right here on the left, John Doggett. John's going to be taking the side of pro net zero by 2050. I don't know why he accepted that. But he'll take that side, and Alex will be talking about the other side. So hopefully you can join us for that as well in a few months, in about a month or so. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Great. Yes.